I could give an indication of the great diversity of his interests by reciting his publications, but I won't do that. I can't do that because that would take all afternoon. So what I'd like to do is to draw attention to his long-standing intellectual relationship with Hannah Arendt. In 1984, his book, Hannah Arendt, Politics, Conscience, Evil, those words resonate throughout his dialogue with Hannah Arendt. There was an early book in the great proliferation of Hannah Arendt scholarship. It was a landmark then, and it remains a landmark today. The book was preceded, actually, by several essays from the 1970s and earlier 80s. So, in other words, the contact between Kateb and Arendt was made, almost 35 years ago. And today, it is at least as vital as it was at its beginning. Last year, Professor Kateb's essay, wonderful essay, on existential values in Arendt's treatment of evil and morality, which appeared in Politics in Dark Times, Encounters with Hannah Arendt, edited by Shayla Benabid, still here, good, and published by Cambridge University Press. It's a marvelous book, a collection of essays. In his essay, he explicated human status and human stature, or human uniqueness and human freedom, as the anchors of human existence itself. What takes place between Professor Kateb and Hannah Arendt can be characterized, I think, as a moral dialogue, or rather a dialogue about the place of moral action and moral judgment in politics. It is not the case that Professor Kateb and Hannah Arendt always agree. Indeed, it is plausible, I believe, to think of him as her American conscience. I love the names of George Kateb's books, and just to mention a couple of them, The Inner Ocean, which is about individualism and democratic character, and in 1992, or Patriotism and Other Mistakes of 2006. It's striking how well the names and dates of those books are matched, and this is certainly the case with his latest book, Human Dignity, published earlier this year by Harvard University Press. For is it not human dignity that has increasingly proved a mirage in our time, and at the same time, is it not for the sake of human dignity that revolutions have been ignited and right now are spreading throughout the Middle East? This afternoon, Professor Kateb will speak on democracy and lying. I don't know what he's going to say, but certainly nothing needs to be said about the timeliness of his topic.
It is a pleasure to be here and a privilege to be introduced by Jerry Kohn, one of the leading scholars in the work of Hannah Arendt, and who has done as much as anyone has to make her posthumous writings, especially her nachlass especially, available to a wider readership. It's also always a treat to be involved in activities initiated by the New School and by Bard College. I will begin by saying that the title of this paper really should be Democracy and Untruth. And I'll just give you some examples of untruth that will be in the background of my talk when they're not overtly present. The repertory of untruth includes secrets or the withholding of knowledge, propaganda, exaggeration and other kinds of distortion, simplification, construction of stories, denial, and outright lying. A common belief is that one main reason for the superiority of representative democracy to all other political systems is that it works by procedures that compel officials to be held accountable for what they have done. If accountability is to exist, citizens must want it, and people holding office or seeking election to office must provide it. The essential form of accountability is transparency. And as Kirsten McClure said, the other side of transparency sometimes is surveillance, but here transparency in regard to government is surveillance of government, which I take to be the fundamental responsibility of all citizens. And if it takes bloated or perverted forms, as in recent political phenomena, there is a good as well as a perverted or bloated form of keeping government under surveillance. The essential form of accountability is transparency. That is, citizens must want, and officials and would-be officials must provide intelligible, descriptive statements that are also honest or sincere. Sincere, intelligible statements must describe what officials in power have done and why, or must explain what they intend to do and why, and similarly, those who seek office must intelligibly and sincerely say what they would do if elected. It turns out, however, that democracy, with the greatest freedom to speak and the greatest amount of public speech, seems to operate by means of untruth much more than any other political system, at least in contemporary times. Thus, democracy to be genuine requires accountability, and this in turn requires transparency. But transparency is hard to come by in mass democracy, certainly if the U.S. is taken as exemplary, because the political stratum and the principles in media of communication and advertisement stoop low to persuade, organize, and mobilize the people to support policies or products that the leaders think are the right ones or the most profitable ones. Untruth serves various interests and passions of the elite, whether in office or in society, the powerful and advantaged classes in short. Where power is untransparent, accountability is a sham. The real motives of policymakers are obscured, and often what the policymakers have actually done or failed to do, or what they intend to do, is unclear or secret. When policies are difficult to identify or discuss, responsibility becomes diffuse or murky. And incurious or unvigilant people are not served, they are even sacrificed. The situation would be better if people wanted the truth more than they seem to, and tried harder to understand it when it is actually provided, if it is. In a democracy, and this is a paper about blaming the people, blaming the victims. In a democracy, popular deficiencies of attention and understanding set systematic untruth in motion. But let us notice that these deficiencies of opinion dictate only some ill-defined outlines of policy that the political stratum must heed. Rarely is some specific policy or course of action clearly mandated or rejected by the electorate or by a substantial fraction of it. The upshot is that those involved in the making of policy possess a wide discretion. The most awful element antithetical to democracy is discretion, having choice that is unaccountable, a free power to decide without real consultation outside the political stratum itself. Their discretionary use of power, what they do or try to do, will then pass through the mechanisms of untruth before it is judged by an essentially gullible and desirous electorate. Even though officials still must face the minority intent on understanding what was done or is being done and what motives and purposes lay behind it, officials can try to drown out inconvenient truth and often succeed. Except for unignorable, palpable effects and results, the political stratum is given a comparatively free hand, even in a democracy, in the initiation of policy, and then its carrying out. Democratic control is often crude or belated or non-existent. It does not serve to transform psychologically power holders and power seekers into a stratum radically different from power holders and power seekers in oligarchic and other non-democratic forms of government. Let us posit the fairly constant disposition in all those who are attracted to political power. They desire as little restraint on their activities as possible. Those in any political stratum are not usually dominated by the intellectual appetite to understand their own motives or to understand what it means for others to suffer the consequences of their deeds. They are not committed to truth and find the appetite for the desire for untruth in citizens gratifying. As long as citizens in a democracy seem to gravitate towards untruth, the political stratum will remain insufficiently transformed by the democratic political system. Having unaccountable power is a good way of shedding one's democratic upbringing. If citizens do not insistently demand transparency, they will endure a more or less free exercise of power over them. That is, they often see little that is odd in the mere fact that the exercise of power is less democratic and more oligarchic than it should be, and even at times, in segments or episodes, tyrannical or despotic. The appeal to security or emergency or indefinite future benefits will placate the people. The long and short of it is that the solution to the problem of transparency, and hence accountability, is not found in either more democracy or less democracy. If you want more democracy or less democracy or no democracy, you would have to use some political standard other than accountability. If we were better citizens, however, our political stratum would be better, more true to the spirit of constitutional democracy. But bad citizens with democratic rights are still, after all, better than subjects. Left to themselves to rule completely as they please, autocratic rulers or mostly closed elites would do in certain respects and on balance worse things than democratic officials now do, even though these democratic officials are slackly controlled or, when controlled for irrational or unjust purposes, certainly in many areas of public policy. I characterize the situation we have as a grim and fundamentally unimprovable compromise between democracy and oligarchy, and between democracy and non-democratic features inherent in any government, and therefore shared by all of them. But even this description might not be adequately pessimistic. Why do you laugh? It's funny. But I guess it isn't really funny. I now turn to a particular area of public policy, foreign policy, because I think that the lack of transparency and accountability in that area is most acute and the effects are most serious. This is not to say that transparency by itself would be a panacea. Much would depend on what citizens made of transparency, or even whether they paid receptive attention to an appreciably greater amount of it. I think that from the early 20th century onward, foreign policy has been the most important area of public policy in the United States and some other Western democracies. For a century and a bit more, foreign policy has manifestly taken over first place in the minds of key figures in the political stratum, even when they're silent about the subject. The reason is that the United States has become, with ever-gathering strength, an imperial power. Foreign policy works havoc on modern constitutional democracy, no matter how unadventurous the policy is, but an active foreign policy increases the damage. Then, when a constitutional democracy has a foreign policy of global reach, which is by definition an imperialist foreign policy, then every problem of transparency is intensively and systematically aggravated. An imperialist foreign policy recurrently violates the principles of constitutional democracy at home and abroad just by being imperialistic. Imperialistic, that is, interfering with people and killing and dispossessing them on a global scale. No foreign policy can be conducted democratically, but an imperialist one removes the controlling functions of citizens from the picture almost completely. The people as a body of citizens are, for the most part, out of the story of foreign policy, left out, except as resources, that is, bodies and taxes, and as sources of psychological support, sending back to the foreign policy elite the elite's dispositions, but now magnified, simplified, and made more urgent or gross by mass sentiment. Foreign policy makes vividly clear that in modern democracy, the people are masters who are also slaves. Their energies are needed, but are turned against their interests because of their own passions. Slaves to their passions, the people are made slaves to the interests of elites. They are seduced or manipulated by the several forms of untruth which I began this presentation by itemizing. But unfortunately, the people often feel as if their energies are being spent in the direction they desire. So, now let us turn to the foreign policy elite, the political stratum involved in making a foreign policy. Their discretionary power is a good deal greater than official discretionary power is in domestic policy. That means foreign policy, less predictability. Citizens are often surprised by what foreign policy officials do. When people vote for candidates, they can only pass a retrospective judgment on any past conduct in foreign policy that officials engaged in. They can't instruct candidates with any assurance of being listened to. They can rarely say, therefore, that officials broke their word, though sometimes, rarely, that has happened, especially with Wilson and FDR in the matter of involvement in Europe's wars. How tight can the tie be between elections and the decision to initiate or maintain war? But our theme is transparency as a basis for accountability. If officials do more or less as they please in the area of foreign policy, putatively the most important area of public policy, do they at least give sincere accounts of what they have done or are planning to do? The record shows that characteristically they do not. The proportion of official untruth in foreign policy is greater even than in domestic policy. In assertions that officials make concerning their motives and purposes or the strategies that impel or guide their policies, and also concerning the descriptions they give of events that took place or are taking place and of plans for the future, observers of foreign policy can count on the proliferation of untruth and do so without cynicism. which is the vulgar form of realism. Citizens of the mass can be cynical even in regard to foreign policy, not just domestic policy, but foreign policy is felt as remote or is made by the media to seem remote, and therefore the untruth doesn't usually register powerfully. Yes, President G.W. Bush lied the country into a war of aggression against Iraq, but he was re-elected anyway. To whom in the United States do the system of lies matter as lies, let alone the vast destruction, dislocation, and dispossession inflicted by American arms on the Iraqi people? Lying mattered to numerous observers and some citizens, but was not a majority sentiment. His approval ratings never recovered after the poor response to the Katrina hurricane that hit New Orleans in 2005, but it is not clear that the exposure of lies about Iraqi collusion with al-Qaeda in the events of 9/11 and about Iraqi possession of weapons of mass destruction had much, if anything, to do with Bush's loss of approval after his re-election. Democratic accountability goes on holiday when foreign policy is made and judged. My aim in this paper is not to suggest a general theory of the impact of foreign policy, imperialist or not, on the values and institutions of constitutional democracy, but to consider just one, though major democratic value: transparency. That is, the accountability of office officials and their veracity in the medium of speech. Transparency is at an absolute minimum in the conduct of foreign policy in an imperialist democracy, in part because all the deficiencies of citizens are heightened. The discretionary power of the elite is therefore maximized. What accounts for this heightening of the deficiencies of citizens, it seems to me, is largely the sentiment of patriotism. An imperialist foreign policy runs on untruth in a democracy, perhaps more there than in any other political system short of totalitarianism. Democratic imperialism is built on systematic inconsistency with itself and leads the political straightman into systematic untruth. Did anyone at Athens ever accuse Athens of self-inconsistency in the career of its imperialism? Perhaps by implication the Socrates of Gorgias, but even that is not clear. At least it happens here. One reason for the superiority of American over Athenian democracy. Here is the gist of that story that people tell and believe about imperialist foreign policy. In this account, every motive of the elite is honorable, unself-interested, high-minded, and well-intentioned, while the motives of the other side are evil, inhuman, or not humanly recognizable. Then, the shortcomings of one side are owed to a general human weakness or fallibility, not to the will to power, or the will to prevail, or to crude or narrow interests, while the other side is rendered as only solely cruel and fanatical. And then last in this story, in this just so story, a moral reason can always be found that permits one's own side, any action or policy in pursuit of a supposedly great good, or, in quotation marks, just war. And the good washes away, supposedly, the suffering inflicted by the pursuit of this supposedly great good. President Obama's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech is a model of a just so story, a comforting, dreamlike untruth about U.S. foreign policy The entire record from the end of World War II to the present is celebrated as one continuous struggle to make the world better. The speech gives in concentrated form what establishment media disseminate constantly and what people want to hear. Reassurance, whenever U.S. foreign policy is discussed and whatever it is like. Reassurance, and also absolution, and also delusional hope. His speech ratified the typical story the advocates of U.S. global foreign policy tell, and it is bad as any outright series of lies. I would like now to propose a general characterization of the attitudes and dispositions that take hold in those who make foreign policy, and that therefore facilitate the loss of transparency and the dissemination of untruth. I have referred to the repertory of untruth, sequence, withholding of knowledge, propaganda, exaggeration, other kinds of distortion, simplification, construction of stories, denial, and outright lying. But we must not omit another cause of untruth, referred to by practically everyone who spoke earlier, which is self-deception. I think the greatest passage on self-deception occurs in Proust, and which indicates that sometimes those who begin by disseminating untruth knowingly and deliberately come to believe what they are saying, at least some of the time. They talk themselves into a conviction of truth of their convenient rationalization, but occasionally the truth forces its way back into their minds, only to be forced out again. In talking about the mental makeup of the foreign policy elite, I use three categories to give a condensed characterization. First, affinity to criminality. Criminality, what is it? It's violence for collectively selfish ends. Second, corruption by responsibility. And here the target is Weber's essay on politics as a vocation. I find the ethic of responsibility perfectly perfidious for this reason, that what responsibility turns out to mean is not the preservation of the legitimate interests of the people, but the preservation of the international power of the country figured as one person playing a game. It's a commitment to the beautiful organization to which Kirsty referred in her presentation. That's what politics as a vocation is. Really, that's what it is. Save the tiger at any cost. To the cubs. Okay. Concerning unreality, I will concentrate on unreality rather than criminality and responsibility as constituent elements of the makeup of a foreign policy elite, whether in a democracy or not, but made all the worse when the democracy is imperialistic. In this paper, I've several times referred to the abstractness involved when the foreign policy elite think about foreign policy. That is a large part of the unreality they inhabit, but there are other elements of this unreality. Of course, I'm trying to think my way into the elite mentality, and I'm doing so on the basis of analogous miniature experiences that I have had in my own life. I don't think there's understanding the other without some measure of projection of the same of the self-same into the other. I mean to deny the view that the elite make another reality that must be taken on its own terms, as if it were, in Wittgenstein's baleful phrase, a form of life, just as, say, art and literature do. These self-described realists in the foreign policy elite, or the observers of it, these self-described realists imagine they experience a more intense and genuine form of reality. only because they exercise an often fantastically powerful will. They are fanatics of power, and therefore lose that sense of proportion that a true realism requires. That means that no one member, not even any of the few at the very top, can know completely what goes on when a given policy is executed. Members may know the basic strategy, but this knowledge is abstract and hardly stable. On the other hand, a policy, joined to numerous other concurrent policies, is made up of countless specific actions over a wide geographical area. In a strict sense, the elite don't know what they are doing. How could they then speak truthfully of it? How could the people begin to comprehend what's happening, even if they wish to? There's too much to absorb. The course of activity in a whole foreign policy, or the course of a war in its actions, does not unfold like the plot of a novel. There is no official who can resemble the author of a novel, who controls the events, arranges them into a pattern, and understands the motives and purposes of the characters. But I'm not suggesting an epistemological exoneration of anyone at any level in an imperialist society. The thought that there's too much to absorb, to take in what is happening, gives way rather easily to the idea that the very effort to absorb should be abandoned. Since you can't absorb everything, absorb nothing, and replace reality with a grand abstraction or a glorious picture or a beautiful story. Then too, the unreality that resists adequate utterance also derives from feeling that what is happening is so vast in the scope of its terrible effects that it can't really be happening. It can't be real. We couldn't be capable of inflicting so much harm on others or extorting such cost from our own people. So it's not happening. It's not real. Repression thus takes over. The self-repressed persons must, of course, talk about their policies in distorted ways, or withhold wherever possible those facts that at least some of the people would find abhorrent. How could a president truly face the fact that there is no same proportion between, say, prolonging a war year after year with all its death and destruction, and his motive of not wanting to be accused by the political opposition of weakness, which was the case with Lyndon Johnson, or Nixon's motive of not wanting to surrender to the domestic opposition to the war. Imagine maintaining a war year after year to spite the students of the United States in their opposition to the war. Is that the whole story? No. Am I now caricaturing when I should strain very hard to be more faithful to the nuance of the story? I don't care. I don't think I am. I think I am, in fact, being faithful. Otherwise, I would not have written this book. If the elite could literally see the corpse of every soldier or civilian on their own side or their enemies, if they could see the wounded, if they could see the impoverishment caused by war, if they could see the impoverishment caused by sanctions, if they could see the dispossession and displacement, if they could see the disruptions of everyday life in places affected by war, they would find it harder to go on. Or at least some of the elite could not go on. But I suppose many others in the elite could go on. The military profession does go on. No one can see a whole war in its physicality. Few imaginations are intense and capacious enough to begin to provide a substitute for literal vision. I speak mostly of war because I speak here mostly of imperialism. The U.S. has been at war constantly since 1917. Obviously, what I say, which has the United States in mind in the first instance, applies to every war-making power. I've said that the foreign policy elite, especially in an augmentative or adventurous imperialist society, does not know what it is doing. In thinking from a height, they see what their moral blindness puts before them. The last kind of unreality I would mention is that they don't know what they are doing because they don't know themselves. They don't know their own motives. In a dark or stricken moment, they can't believe that their motives are base or cowardly or so confused. They are unfamiliar with the worst about themselves, which is the bitter fruit of self-examination. You could say that's what really killed Socrates, is self-examination. They are masters of policy and make no attempt to master themselves. This is a lesson as old as philosophy, as old as the lessons of Socrates on the nature of tyranny, whether it is the tyrant in a city or a tyrannical city dominating other cities, as Athens was and as Pericles and Cleon said it was. We are often at a loss to understand why wars are initiated. This is perhaps paradigmatic of the opacity, the obdurate opacity of foreign policy. In an activist foreign policy, public officials thus have many reasons not to tell the truth, and there are many causes for not being able to tell the truth, including the tangled nature of the process of policy formation amid constantly changing circumstances and the elusive nature of the human psyche. Transparency is both undesirable and difficult for those who hold power. On the other hand, people have many reasons for citizens, have many reasons for not wanting the truth, and many causes for not being able to take it in, including the complex and confusing nature of the effects of public policy, as well as the nature of the individual psyche. And I spend some time in this paper, I won't read it, I promise you, on the great value of the model of the dream work in Freud's interpretation of dreams. Dream work is a processing of wakeful reality transferred from the dream to wakeful reality, especially in the matter of foreign policy.
It's interesting.
Where does that leave the observer or the conscientious and attentive citizen? We are not at sea, then at least we are always puzzling over the course of political events. What happened? What is happening? What are the true costs in destruction and waste? What motives are in play? What purposes are in play? Is there a strategy? The given answers to any of these questions rarely provide the full and exact truth. Yet even with a sincere wish to speak the truth and a sincere wish to hear it, transparency would still be imperfect and intermittent. Untruth would be prevalent. But the actual prevalence of untruth is owed largely to either the deliberate or the unconscious avoidance of transparency by both officials and citizens, and by officials because of the citizens. This avoidance seems to dominate foreign policy especially, and all the more when that policy is activist to the point of imperialism. In the face of these obstacles, how can we ever know what we perhaps most desire to know? How can we achieve more transparency for ourselves even though others don't share our concern? Can our powers of inference be strengthened? A large dose of powerless skepticism towards official rhetoric about foreign policy appears to be right. But look, an anti-skeptic can say that the psychology of the political stratum is political psychology, which is comparatively simple and does not reach into the depths of the individual psyche. Political involvement does not use the whole psyche. It typically does not involve the inner life, and thus avoids the incessant interplay between the inner life and overt conduct that dominates everyday life. Let us notice, example, what a small range of motivation is found in the analyses of Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes. It is reasonable to believe that these three writers are among the greatest political analysts and power holders in all areas of public policy who ever wrote. And if any of them had a philosophy of history, we can make our way around it and try to come up with some fundamental elements of understanding that apply throughout history. Fear, interest, and honor make up the trio of constituted motives or purposes they impute to the political stratum. When the stratum acts in the name of and officially on behalf of the country, which country is imagined in the likeness of a single person with the characteristics of a single person. A single person, however, that is reified and enlarged and that coexists with other such entities, other polities, that lack of superior power above them all. This trio of motives is certainly thought to govern the conduct of foreign policy by Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and myself, up to a point. I myself have employed these motives as the best shortcut to explaining foreign policy. Then, these writers throw in love of power for its own sake. That complicates matters, especially because it is the only motive that is reluctantly avowed. It rarely lends itself to any utterance, let alone frank utterance. But this complication need not impede analysis, so the anti-skeptics go. Before attempting to rebut this anti-skeptical line, I am a skeptic to the effect that I will ever be able to understand, really understand, why the U.S. launched a war of aggression against Iraq, for example, or why FDR pushed Japan back and back and necessitated a Japanese attack on American interests. And so on. You could, what? Just think of the Vietnam War. Did you understand what brought it on? Really? And the Korean War, MacArthur's execution of it, approaching the hour. Do you understand why he did this and prolonged the war and multiplied tens of thousands of deaths? I am a skeptic, but before attempting to rebut this anti-skeptical line, the anti-skeptical line built on the contribution of Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes, I wish to reinforce this anti-skeptical line by reinforcing the contrast between political psychology and the psychology of everyday life. Isn't it the case that only in our endlessly diverse and multifaceted relations and transactions in society can the developed individual psyche display itself in its fullness, while at the same time be subject to the hold of the unconscious and the subconscious? There in everyday life, human beings often remain opaque to one another, and literature exists to make human life on an everyday basis less opaque. To be sure, some of the work of analysis can be done of political analysis can be done if the trio of much of the analysis of everyday life can be done if the trio of political motives is extended from the personified state back to real individuals, together with the love of power for its own sake. But seeing everyday psychology by means of the categories of political psychology does not come close to adequacy when we try to think about why people are doing what they do in leading their lives and pursuing their aims, despite the fact that we can attribute to everyone certain basic needs and desires. I'm now still speaking what I believe to be true, but trying to strengthen the anti-skeptical position about political conduct. The range of motives a political psychologist could say in everyday life and with truth is as extensive as the range of feelings, emotions, passions, and drives, and includes love and affection, remorse and atonement, yearning and desire, the wish to conform and the will to deviate, gregariousness and misanthropy. These have nothing to do with political psychology. Why am I making such a fuss about the opacity of political psychology? Make any fuss you want about the opacity of everyday life and individual psychology, but leave political psychology to the realists, who are not skeptical of their ability to explain what is happening. And I find their explanations excellent as a beginning, but finally inadequate. As inadequate as explanations of our conduct in our dealings with each other in everyday life. The complexity of mores and manners and the diversity of institutional arrangements allow in everyday life for or demand a corresponding psychological complexity and help to make it possible, while the vicissitudes of the inner life, conscious or barely conscious or altogether out of the reach of consciousness, mingle with rules and conventions to produce a complexity of psyche and hence in everyday life a complexity of unpredictable conduct. Personal motives and purposes can be subtle or inchoate, impulsive or cold-blooded, self-aware or subconscious. Literature often draws out the meaning and implications of these countless and often unforeseeable and hence surprising aspects of the psyche in private everyday life. Analysis of everyday life, yes, must be not only complex to be adequate to the complexity it analyzes, it must be subtle. As say Proust and Henry James are subtle. But you don't have to be subtle to talk about power politics, do you? Such subtlety that Henry James and Proust and Dostoevsky and others show must be more consciously subtle than the subtle conduct it analyzes. Now, this is not to deny that political psychology might have some subtleties of its own that are not reducible to tactical or strategic considerations. But what matters for analysis, so goes the line of Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes, the greatest of them, is the fundamental simplicity of basic motives and purposes. That means that political events are not nearly as psychologically interesting as everyday experience, just because political psychology is simpler than everyday psychology, which, as literature attests, is inexhaustibly worthy of thinking about. I'll be done in a few minutes, a few seconds. But my concessions to the anti-skeptics, to the so-called realists, or to the real realists, like Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes, stop when a fundamental fact asserts its claims. Political life unleashes in the psychology of the political stratum the sense of possibility, which is most deeply entrenched in imperialist foreign policy. That sense is a standing challenge to analysts who confine themselves to a more complex yet still basically simple political psychology in all the cases they analyze, whether the origins of the Peloponnesian War or the wars between states in Machiavelli and Hobbes. That sense of possibility that those possessed of political power, especially in foreign policy, and confident of their superiority to their own people and to the people that they wish to intimidate, coerce, or make war. That sense of possibility is a standing challenge to analysts who confine themselves to a more complex, as I say, yet still basically simple political psychology. Concentrated power in the hands of any elite, even in a democracy, is a standing temptation to adventures, or even to the disposition to engage in not merely adventures, but into sustained adventurism. Fear, interest, and honor, joined to love of power for the sake of power, do not exhaust the range of political motives and purposes. A sense of possibility is, in other terms, a sense of indefinite freedom in which imagination plays the key role. Strange motives may come to dominate, but more power in the hands of the elite, the more their imagination roams. Not only does unpredictability enter the situation, but the difficulty of catching up with the action and deciphering it. At its worst, adventurism approaches being motiveless, a cruel parody of Kant's purposiveness without purpose. It is hard, perhaps impossible, for members of the elite to recognize, formulate, and confess this passion. But it wasn't for Alcibiades. He's the one you want to study, to understand. Imperialism. More U.S. than Athenian imperialism. The force of the passion exceeds criminality, overpowers responsibility, and deepens unreality by investing it with magic. The passion is an effort to break out of standard human motivation and into what is unprecedented. The spirit of Dante's Ulysses in Canto 26 of the Inferno, urging his men to transgress limits, to sail through the forbidding landmarks of Hercules, what we call the Straits of Gibraltar. Adventurism is a flight from unreality to a greater unreality, from the self-imposed yoke of ordinary determinism, though not to freedom, but rather to the embrace of chance and fate. High-risk gambling. Explaining this mutation of political psychology beyond Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes is not easy and leaves political action, especially in the foreign policy of the great and imperialist power, largely untransparent and hence unaccountable. It goes on over our heads and behind our backs, and then when it hits home, it leaves us stunned or wondering. Of course, everyday life can show personal equivalence to the political sublime, another term for adventurism. But the political sublime affects us all. Citizens dreamily partake of it and endure its frequently terrible consequences, either with enthusiasm or resignation. We observers must make the effort to penetrate it, even though nothing as we as citizens could ever promise to tame it. Yes, the elite's sense of possibility is a permanent obstacle to our clear understanding of their actions, most acutely in the field of foreign policy. Here's the last few sentences. Every analytic effort for the sake of understanding past or present will be hard, and in many cases impossible. But in making that effort for this event or that, for this war or that, the analyst is performing the best, I mean the most moral, act of citizenship. In this way, the analyst rises and must not be ashamed of rising, at least in aspiration, above the elite and the people, and reaches for an outlook that compels a fight against untruth. The analyst's true craving is for transparency for its own sake, even apart from the democratic and constitutional passion for accountability. Truth in fragments struggles to appear, and does appear, if only barely.